Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Recently we got this question from Savvy21. He asks, how come they didn't use droids like the Separatists did? I always assumed it was because they didn't have enough funding, but if they were rich, why use sentient beings to fight? I believe in the video he commented on, I was talking about why the rebels used the Incom T-65B X-Wing as their primary snub fighter. I mentioned in that video how in the earlier years of the rebellion, funding was less of an issue than manpower. Which leads to this question, well, if funding was an issue, then why didn't the rebels just use a bunch of droids to overwhelm the Empire? Well, let's take a look at the real-world answer first. When George Lucas was making the original Star Wars, it was a pretty low-budget ordeal, and because VFX back then was all practical, it was just too expensive to have more than a few droids on screen at a time, and even then the droids were often played by actual actors. I also think Lucas wanted the Empire to look more robotic in nature. The idea of the white armor and helmet that covers every inch of the Stormtrooper is to make them feel inhuman. Adding the fact that they have essentially serial numbers as an identifier just further pushes this idea that authoritarian regimes hate individuality. And so having the Rebel Alliance using robots as well, that would kind of mix up that message. But if we're looking at this through the lore instead of cinematic techniques and themes, it does make sense for the Rebellion to utilize droids of some kind to supplement their military force. The Confederacy of Independent Systems used droids for two reasons. Like the Rebel Alliance, they were more geographically focused on the Outer Rim and therefore had a severe manpower deficiency when compared to the Republic. Most Outer Rim planets were already struggling to drum up enough manpower for their local defense force, let alone contribute to some larger Federation military. The Separatist High Council leadership also happened to be filled with a bunch of industrial tycoons, ship magnates, and banking barons. These titans of industry were able to quickly retool their assembly lines to create battle droids and war machines. And so despite only having a fraction of the Republic's manpower, territory, and resources, the Separatist Alliance, for the majority of the Clone Wars, experienced a huge numerical advantage over the Grand Army of the Republic because they were able to mass manufacture droids. Now, if you take this into consideration, it becomes very apparent that the Rebel Alliance's struggle is quite similar to the Separatist Alliance's struggle, which brings us to this question a lot of fans ask, why aren't the Rebels using massive amounts of droids, the same tactic? Well, before we get there, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, ownersaber.com. They are the premier lightsaber manufacturer for people looking for unique and replica lightsabers. For instance, I really like the look on this copper claw. Kind of reminds me of something you might see in the more regal Old Republic period of Star Wars. You also have more familiar designs like this guy. This is the First Dawn, and it is a replica of Obi-Wan Kenobi's first and second lightsaber. It's a solid and simple design that is perfect for Form 3 shell defense. Most of ownersaber.com's blades come with either a simple RGB blade, which is really good for sparring and smacking around, or a pixel blade, which has an LED strip running alongside the entire length of the blade, which gives you all sorts of cool effects like this. Right now, all blades from ownersaber.com are 30% off plus free shipping. If you want to check out these lightsabers, there's a link in the description down below. Also, if you use my promo code EWALK, that's all caps, you get an additional $15 off. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. So the perception that the Rebel Alliance didn't use battle droids is actually wrong. They did, but in very specific cases, and usually with Clone Wars era Separatist droids, they almost never manufactured their own battle droids for reasons we'll talk about a little bit later. But let's take a look at the example of Rebel Alliance forces using droids. In the Bad Batch, just months after the Clone Wars ended, we see a Separatist holdout on the planet of Desix use a garrison of droids to attack an Imperial clone unit. Given the fact that you have clones fighting Seppi battle droids here, this is almost an extension of the Clone Wars in a way. Unfinished business, you could say. A very cool episode. In another example, around 2 BBY, the Rebel unit Spectre came upon a Separatist holdout on the world of Agamar. Initially, the Rebels attacked the battle droids, but the super tactical droid in charge, General Kalani, was able to make peace with the Rebel fighter and ex-clone trooper Rex. The unlikely pairing would join forces and together turn their weapons against an approaching Imperial attack force. I bring up this incident because the Seppi droids did not perform very well against the Empire in this situation. Now granted, these droids were more than a decade old, and many were in need of some serious repairs and maybe a memory wipe or two. But certain models like the Droidekas always seem to pose a threat because of their design. But still, I would argue that these Seppi droids perform no better against the Stormtroopers than they did against the Clone Troopers. The last and perhaps most successful attempt to use droids against the Empire was an operation carried out by Cham Syndulla. In 14 BB1, Cham recovered information that Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader were going to visit the rail-off system to inspect the local Imperial garrison. which was super corrupt. Champ, through his network of insurgents, had a huge collection of Separatist Alliance droids and weapons. This included vulture droids, space mines, and buzz droids. When Palpatine's destroyer, the Perilous, enters the system, the space mines stop the ship, at which point Champ Syndulla sends in the buzz droids and the vulture droids. It does a lot of damage to the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, and when the Imperials call for backup, of course, Champ Syndulla sends a few insurgents in maintenance ships, and they sneak on board, and they blow up the ship's reactor. It's an audacious plan, and it is a very successful plan, and I think this was a great example of what a relatively small insurgency group could do by supplementing their manpower with the right type of droid weapons. But I think you might be noticing a trend here. None of these three factions are using droids they manufactured or built themselves. They're all using Clone Wars era Separatist droids, of which I'm sure there are billions if not trillions just lying around in the galaxy at the end of the Clone Wars. And as we see in the Agmar battle, their technology, their armor, their weapons, it's all kind of out of date. And even though technology does stagnate from time to time in Star Wars history, usually because of chaos or extreme periods of peace, from the beginning of the Clone Wars to the end of the Galactic Civil War, there was a huge ramping up of military research and production. Some might say it's due to the 1,000-year peace that preceded the Clone Wars, but I mostly attribute it to Palpatine and his paranoia. And so by 0 BB1, these droids which were manufactured during the Clone Wars were completely obsolete. Another contributing factor is the fact that all battle droids were outlawed by the Galactic Empire. This was most likely just some populist policy pushed by Palpatine, playing on the hatred and fear that many people had developed for droids. This discrimination and hatred was especially common in the Outer Rim regions where most of the heavy fighting occurred.
Some droids on Plazir date back to the Separatists. The New Republic would send them to scrap. But here on Plazir, they are given a second chance.
We don't serve their kind here.
What?
Your droids. They'll have to wait outside. We don't want them here.
I mean, look at Din Djarin. He's generally a sweet and open-minded individual for someone who's in an orthodox cult, but whenever he sees a droid, he can't help but shoot it in the face or at least give it a good whack for absolutely no reason. This is a deeply rooted hatred that stems from trauma, and I'm sure a lot of rebels also had that same trauma as well. But the battle droid ban was probably the much larger issue. There were just simply no manufacturers creating battle droids anywhere. Like during the Imperial period, you had bans on the sale of proton torpedoes and starships to non-Imperial military entities. But the rebels still got their hands on the stuff either through the black market or just through sympathetic companies. But since no one was creating battle droids anywhere, you couldn't even smuggle them or find them. The Empire was able to get around their own rules through smart marketing. If there is a profit to be made, there's a rule that can be circumvented. And so Holo-1 Laboratories and Araket Industries would classify their products, like the KX series security droids, as security droids. And technically speaking, they usually weren't equipped with weapons and used for policing, and so they weren't technically battle droids. The rebels also had tons of droids helping them out, but they were mostly asteroid droids and not battle droids as well. I also want to take a look at the, advantages and disadvantages of having human soldiers versus droid soldiers. Human fighters are annoying because they have a lot of maintenance needs: food, water, shelter, entertainment, oxygen, and waste disposal when you put them on ships. Droids really just have that upfront building cost, and then there's some light maintenance. You might need to do some memory wipes every now and then, oil baths. The CIS used to store thousands of droids inside of ships like shirts on a clothing rack. You could simply transport more droids a lot easier than you can with humans. But droids were also predictable. Even advanced models like the commando droids had their routines that could be studied and countered. Droids also lacked initiative and needed either oversight or relatively simple mission objectives like defend this area or attack this building. This is why when the Jedi carried out a massive set-piece battle during the Geonosis incident, they were playing right into the hands of the Separatists. The clone commandos that the Jedi had access to were experts at stealth insertion behind enemy lines. They could have just snuck into the factories and blown them up. You didn't need that entire invasion. And if you look at the rebellion, especially in the earlier days, they were constantly doing stealth missions and breaking contact the second the Empire was alerted to their presence. The rebels needed intelligent soldiers that could operate independently if needed. We have seen clones during the Clone Wars operate in mixed clone and droid units, and even then the battle droids didn't really serve much of a purpose other than getting the clones past SEPI checkpoints. They weren't very useful in combat. The only time droid stealth insertion seemed to work was by using astromechs or protocol droids that could blend in on an Imperial base. And this was the preferred droid tactic used by the rebels. Now, in the later stages of the Galactic Civil War, when the rebellion had turned into the New Republic, things were a little bit different. The two sides became more evenly matched and there were more conventional battles, but I still don't think the rebellion would have used droids during this period, and I think that has to do a lot with Mon Mothma's ideology. She was just against militarism of any kind. Mon Mothma had just seen the Galactic Republic turn into an authoritarian military-first dictatorship. This was all driven by fear-mongering and warfare. I mean, the New Republic was lucky to even get the Mark I Starhawk capital ship program approved. And the idea of using, mass-produced battle droids to overwhelm the Empire was just not something Mon Mothma would be comfortable doing. First, she wanted the Empire to surrender. She wanted to give Imperial officers and stormtroopers every opportunity to give up and join the creepy New Republic rehabilitation program. Sending endless waves of killer battle droids sends the complete opposite message to the Imperial remnant. I also believe that Mon Mothma would see using battle droids as a threat to a democracy's abilities to properly judge when to wage war. It's one thing to have your civilians risk their lives in service and also be allowed to vote for whether the New Republic goes to war. But if the entire New Republic military was made of droids, then voters have much less consequences when voting for war. And this is exactly what happened during the Clone Wars. De-escalation talks between Padme Amidala and Mina Bonetari failed because of a lack of popular support on both sides. The citizens of the Republic and the CIS were not fighting in the war, unless they were a part of a planetary defense force. The majority of the dying was done by clones and droids. Lastly, when it comes to cyber warfare and communications warfare, the Empire was simply too far ahead of the rebellion. Thrawn wasn't a huge fan of droid armies because they were usually centrally controlled, and that could be a huge liability. The Empire's huge army of slicers and intelligence agencies could potentially even hijack a theoretical rebel droid army and use it to destroy the rebellion. So there you have it, guys. Those are the various reasons why I believe the Rebel Alliance never sought to use a large battle droid army. Let me know in the comment section below if I've missed anything, and as usual, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, the democracy.